and therefore the responsibility of raising the challenge is typically in the hands of those who recognize that they have a subordinate status. It's very hard to recognize that. I mean, people live, for millennia, without recognizing that they are being subordinated in systems of power. I mean, that's true of women, for example. Or slaves, I mean, most slave societies were accepted by the slaves as legitimate and in fact necessary. A large part, and the same is true of, for example, people who have jobs today in our society. Almost without exception, they consider it legitimate for them to be in a position where they have to rent themselves in order to survive. That's certainly not obvious, and in fact, if you go back a century ago, it was not only considered not obvious, it was considered outlandish by American working people. And I'm not talking about Marxists or socialists or anybody like that, but say mill hands in Lowell, Massachusetts, who never heard of socialism, who regarded it as a form of slavery and were complaining that they had not fought the Civil War to replace chattel slavery by wage slavery, and that therefore those who work in the mills ought to own them. Because that's the Republican rights that we won in the American Revolution, and so on and so forth. So, it's not obvious. But by now, I think enough indoctrination and propaganda and so on has taken place, so people do regard that form of subordination to external authority as legitimate. Whether they should is another question. But the fact is they do, just as for most of history, women have accepted a subordinate role as correct and proper and so on, and slaves did, and people living in, say, feudal societies. In a feudal society, people had a place, some kind of role, and quite typically the societies were stable because people regarded those structures as legitimate. The same is true of religious structures, and I mean, throughout human life, there's a whole variety of systems of authority and oppression and domination and so on, which are usually accepted as legitimate by the people subordinated to them. When they don't, you have struggles and revolutions and sometimes changes and sometimes brutality and so on.